I pulled up to the cabin as dusk was falling over the thick woods of the Appalachian Mountains. It was a secluded place, far from any nearby towns, the kind of spot where people came to get away from the world. It was 2018, and I'd been planning this trip for months. The cabin was an old, worn-down place, but that was part of its charm. It had a rustic appeal, kind of how you imagine a cabin to look in an old Western movie. Built around the 1920s with creaky wooden floors and a porch that had seen better days. I was 32 at the time and had recently gone through a breakup. It felt like the perfect place to clear my head and find some peace. The drive had been long, winding through narrow, misty roads that cut through the forest. The farther I went, the more isolated it seemed. No cars, no houses, just trees. Lots of trees. As I parked near the front steps, I took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, pine-scented air. It felt good to be away from everything. I grabbed my bag and my dog. Benny, a scruffy mutt with a heart of gold, jumped out of the truck with me. He was an old dog now, getting a little slower, but he loved the outdoors. The cabin's exterior had a worn, weathered look, like it had fought off years of rain and snow. The kind of place that could tell 100 stories if it could talk. The wooden beams that held it together were strong, though, and there was something oddly comforting about that. I made my way up the steps to the front door, feeling the creak of each one beneath my boots. Inside, the air smelled of wood and dust, with a faint hint of something musty that couldn't be ignored. The furniture was old but functional. An old couch covered in faded plaid, a worn-out dining table, and a fireplace with a pile of chopped logs waiting to be used. I lit the fireplace immediately, the crackling sound of the flames offering a sense of warmth that seemed to cut through the chill of the evening air. Benny lay down by my feet, letting out a sigh as he rested. I threw a few blankets on the couch, made myself a drink, and settled in for the night. But the quiet of the woods, the isolation, started to feel heavier as the night wore on. It wasn't just the silence. It was something else, something unexplainable. I kept hearing small noises, things that made me look over my shoulder. But when I did, nothing was there. Could have been the wind or the house settling. Could have been my nerves, too. But after a few hours, I started to wonder. Benny was lying on his side, snoring lightly, but his ears were perked. Every now and then, his head would lift, his eyes staring at the shadows in the far corner of the room, before slowly lowering back down. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was nothing. But then I heard a noise, something that wasn't just the wind or the house creaking. A soft thud came from upstairs. I froze. Benny immediately lifted his head again, and this time he was more alert, his body tense. I stood up slowly, not wanting to make any sudden moves. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved toward the stairs. The upstairs wasn't much, just a small loft with a bed and a couple of chairs. Nothing worth investigating. I slowly started to climb, each step sending a shiver down my spine. The further up I went, the more I felt like I was walking into something wrong. When I reached the top, I hesitated before peeking around the corner. The upstairs was as still as the rest of the cabin, but there was something different about the way the shadows clung to the walls. It felt like they were alive, like they were hiding something. I checked every room, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Nothing out of place. No one else was here. I told myself it was just the isolation, the silence playing tricks on me. But as I descended the stairs and walked back to the couch, I heard it again. Another thud, louder this time, came from outside. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door cautiously, stepping out onto the porch. The air was colder now, and the darkness seemed to press in on all sides. There was no moon, only the faintest glimmer of stars scattered across the sky. Benny was right behind me, staying close. I shone the light out into the yard, scanning the edges of the trees. The woods were silent again, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Couldn't shake it. I stood there for a few minutes, but I couldn't see anything. Nothing moved. Maybe it was just an animal or the wind, I told myself again. But then I saw something, a figure, standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, too tall. I squinted, trying to make out the details, but all I could see was a silhouette, a dark shape against the trees. My heart began to race. Benny's hackles were raised, and he started to growl, a low, guttural sound that didn't seem to be directed at anything specific. The figure didn't move, just stood there, like it was waiting for something. I backed up slowly, trying to keep my calm, but every step felt like a mistake. The figure was still there, unmoving. As I retreated into the cabin, I slammed the door behind me, locking it quickly. I leaned against the door, my breathing shallow. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I knew I wasn't alone. The rest of the night was a blur. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind made me jump. Benny stayed by my side, never once leaving me. The strange feeling didn't fade. I tried to sleep, but my mind raced, the shadows in the corners of the room making it impossible to relax. By the time the first light of dawn started to break through the trees, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I didn't care what was going on. I just needed to get out of there. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved things into my bag. Benny stood by the door, his eyes never leaving me, like he understood the urgency. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Was it all in my head? Was it the isolation getting to me? But something about that figure outside, the way it stood there unmoving, didn't sit right with me. I drove off as fast as I could, the cabin fading in my rearview mirror. The road back felt endless, every twist and turn making me feel like I was being followed. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped for gas, taking a moment to calm down. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, greeted me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. I finally asked, trying to keep my voice steady, Is there anyone else around here? Anyone that lives near the cabins?" He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, just the old cabin up on the hill. Ain't no one been up there in years." I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't need to. There was something about that place, something I wasn't meant to know. It would stay with me for a long time, that feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the woods, waiting. But at least I got out. That was the important thing. I don't go back to that cabin, not ever. And every time I drive through the mountains now, I can't help but glance up at the trees, wondering what's still hiding up there, just out of sight. It had been 3 months since I'd finalized the divorce. 3 months since I had left behind everything I thought I wanted. My old life, my old house, the memories with someone I once loved. But now the weight was starting to lift. In the quiet of my cabin, I could feel it, the beginning of something new. I hadn't intended on getting a cabin so far out, but when I found it, something about it felt right. Tucked away in the small hills of Western Virginia, far from the city lights and the noise of my old life, the cabin offered nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional cry of a bird. It was a modest little place, 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a living area with an old stone fireplace. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. It was what I needed. I drove up one morning, not long after the divorce papers were signed. The place was perfect for escaping the people who knew me and the people who thought they knew me. I'd left everything behind, the shared friends, the family gatherings, the feeling of being stuck. Now here I was, alone. It was late autumn, the chill of the season creeping into the air as the sun dipped low. The trees were in their prime, dressed in hues of orange and gold, their leaves tumbling down like confetti. The cabin sat in the middle of a stretch of land that seemed untouched, surrounded by the kind of stillness you only find in places no one else bothers to go. I knew the isolation might be a challenge, but at that moment, it felt like a blessing. That first night, I lit a fire and curled up with a book I had been meaning to read for ages. The cabin was small, but the fire kept it warm. Crackled and popped, the sound oddly comforting. As the flames danced, my thoughts wandered back to the months before, to the things I'd left behind. My ex-husband, Sam, was still a raw subject for me. We'd been married for 6 years, but it hadn't worked. It felt like the more we tried to fix it, the worse it got. In the end, we both knew it was time to go our separate ways. The divorce hadn't been messy. It was just quiet, a slow fade, the kind of relationship where no one was really at fault, but both parties were still bruised. He'd gotten the house, the car, the stuff. I took whatever I could fit into my car and came here. It had been hard, though. I wasn't exactly used to being on my own. As the fire burned down to embers, I felt the heaviness of the day lift. I stood up and stretched, deciding it was time to head to bed. But then, just as I turned to walk down the narrow hallway to the bedroom, I heard it. A noise. It was faint at first, like a soft thud. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe it was an animal outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening, my eyes glued to the door. But there was nothing more, just the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind. I shook my head. It's nothing, I told myself, slipping under the covers. I hadn't planned to stay here for long, maybe just a few weeks to clear my head. Then I'd figure out what was next. But after a few days, I found myself sinking into a routine. The mornings were peaceful, spent sipping coffee on the porch and watching the sun rise over the hills. The days were filled with small projects. Fixing up the garden, cleaning the gutters, trimming the overgrown shrubs. It was hard work, but it kept my mind occupied. Then came the evening when it happened. I had just returned from a trip into town, where I had gone to pick up some supplies. It was already dark by the time I pulled into the driveway. I noticed something right away. There was a light on inside. The only person who had a key was Sam, but there was no way he would have come out here. Not after everything. I hadn't heard from him since the day I signed the papers. My first instinct was to call the police, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and made my way to the front door. The porch creaked beneath my feet as I stepped up to it, my heart pounding in my chest. The light inside flickered again, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but something didn't feel right. The door was unlocked. It swung open easily with a creak. The living room was dim, only the faintest light coming from the lamp next to the fireplace. I could see the shadows of furniture, nothing out of place at first glance. But then I noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. A musty, earthy odor, something that made my stomach churn. It was the kind of smell you get in old basements or abandoned buildings, the kind that makes you wonder what kind of secrets they hold. I called out softly, but there was no answer. Stepping inside, I moved cautiously. Every floorboard groaned under my weight. I reached for the light switch, but when I flicked it on, nothing happened. The bulb must have gone out. The thudding noise came again, louder this time. My heart rate quickened. I had no idea what it was, but I knew I wasn't alone. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way toward the back of the house, my breath coming in short bursts. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the hallway leading to the bedroom. As I neared the door, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scrape, like something was being dragged across the floor. I swung the door open, the beam of light cutting through the darkened room. And that's when I saw him. It wasn't Sam, but someone I didn't recognize. A man, crouched by the bed, rummaging through my things. His back was to me, and I froze, not knowing what to do. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned slowly, and our eyes locked. I don't know what made me act next, but I didn't think. I raised the flashlight and swung it down toward his head. He ducked just in time, and the flashlight hit the floor with a loud crack. But I didn't stop. I lunged at him, and we both tumbled to the ground in a heap. It was a blur of limbs, of desperate movements. I could feel his weight, his hands trying to grab at me, but I fought back with everything I had. I pushed him off, scrambling for anything to defend myself. My fingers found the metal of a lamp base, and I swung it with all my strength, connecting with his shoulder. He let out a grunt of pain, but I didn't stop. In the chaos, I managed to break free, rushing toward the door and slamming it shut behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I couldn't stop shaking. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed my phone, dialing the police. As I waited for them to arrive, I heard nothing. Not a single sound from the man. I couldn't tell if he had left or if he was still in the house. When the police finally arrived, they searched the cabin, but the man was gone. No trace of him anywhere. They assured me it was probably a trespasser or someone desperate, but I wasn't so sure. Whoever he was, he knew the place too well to just wander in. The authorities never found out who he was or why he was there. But that night, I knew one thing for sure. The cabin wasn't just a quiet escape. It was a place that had secrets of its own. Secrets that maybe even I wasn't meant to uncover. The feeling of unease lingered for weeks after, and though I stayed, I knew I'd never be able to forget what happened. The light I had once found so comforting now seemed like a warning. And yet life moved on. The man never returned. The cabin slowly became home. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the cabin I was running from. It was the past. And maybe some things are best left buried. The rain hit the roof of the small cabin in a steady rhythm, like 1,000 tiny drums being played in unison. I sat by the fireplace, staring at the orange glow, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. It was just me and the storm, the crackle of the fire, the only sound that kept me company. My fingers gripped the edge of the worn-out armchair as I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had crept up on me since I arrived. I wasn't sure what had drawn me to this cabin, isolated in the thick woods of the Appalachian Mountains. Maybe it was the idea of escaping from everything, the noise of city life, the stress of work, the endless social obligations. I'd rented this place for the weekend, eager to clear my head and recharge. But now, with the storm raging outside, I felt anything but peaceful. The cabin had a rustic charm, but also an unsettling stillness. It was small, made of rough-hewn timber, with a single room that served as both living space and kitchen. There was a loft with a bed up top and a rickety ladder to reach it. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls seemed to close in around me the longer I stayed. Even though the place was in decent shape, something about it felt off, like it had been abandoned for years, left to weather the storms alone. I shifted in my seat, feeling the warmth from the fire seep into my skin, but it didn't seem to chase away the chill in my bones. The storm outside seemed to grow worse, the wind howling through the trees, rattling the windows, and the rain coming down harder, almost like sheets of glass. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and tried to focus on the fire, the only thing keeping me grounded. I had no cell service up here, no Wi-Fi, nothing. It was just me and the storm, and the occasional sound of something moving outside. At first, I chalked it up to the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized that the noises outside weren't just the storm. There was something else, something heavy, like a footstep crunching through the underbrush. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked over to the window, peering through the rain-soaked glass. The world outside was dark, the trees swaying violently in the wind, but I saw nothing, just the endless rain and darkness. I told myself it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But when I returned to my seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every few minutes, I'd hear another noise outside, something scraping against the cabin, like claws dragging across wood, or a low thud, like something heavy dropping onto the ground. My pulse quickened, and I found myself constantly glancing toward the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. I grabbed the small flashlight from my bag, just to have something in case I needed it. I wasn't sure why I felt so uneasy. It was probably just the isolation, the storm, the unfamiliarity of the place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching, waiting. The fire flickered, and I glanced up at the chimney, where the smoke seemed to gather, swirling in the dim light. The wood crackled loudly, almost too loudly, and then a sharp bang came from the back of the cabin. A sound so sudden and forceful it made me jump out of my seat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the wind. The sound had come from inside the cabin. I took a cautious step toward the source, the back door, and as I did, I heard something moving again. This time it was unmistakable. Someone was outside. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to rush to the door and check, but the other part of me knew that would be foolish. I was alone here, in the middle of nowhere, with a storm closing in, and no way to defend myself if something went wrong. My mind raced, my heart beating like a drum. There was a heavy thud on the back door, so loud that I nearly jumped out of my skin. My eyes widened in panic as I backed away from the door, the flashlight shaking in my hands. Then silence. For a moment, everything was still. I held my breath, waiting, listening for the next sound. Nothing. I didn't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, but finally, the tension in my body gave way to exhaustion. I had to check. I had to know if someone was out there or if it was just my imagination. So, I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously made my way to the door. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the doorknob, the wind howling outside, rain streaming down the glass. There was something in the air, a thick, oppressive sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. The storm outside roared as I stepped onto the porch, the wind tugging at my clothes. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I scanned the area, my heart racing in my chest. There was nothing, no sign of anything unusual, just the wet earth, the rain, and the dense forest surrounding the cabin. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye, a trail of muddy footprints, just beyond the porch. They were fresh, and they led away from the cabin into the woods. My stomach twisted in fear as I realized just how close whatever had been outside had been. I could hear the sound of the rain hitting the leaves, but nothing else. No more footsteps, no more scraping sounds. It was as if whatever had been there was waiting for me to open the door, as if it had been watching. I didn't waste another second. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed back to the chair by the fire, gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles ached. The wind howled outside, and I sat there in the near darkness, the fire flickering in front of me, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something had been out there, something that didn't belong in the woods. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. My thoughts raced as I thought about the footprints outside, the strange noises, the sudden feeling of being watched. My mind kept going back to one thing. The thing outside had wanted me to see it. It had wanted me to know it was there. I sat frozen, the fire now nothing more than a few embers, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the cabin. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. The storm wasn't going to let up, and the feeling of unease was growing stronger. I didn't know what I was afraid of exactly, but I was certain I wasn't alone. In the end, I made the decision to leave. I grabbed my things, stuffed them into my bag, and as quietly as I could, slipped out the back door. The rain hit me hard as I ran, the cold water soaking through my clothes in seconds. The cabin disappeared into the darkness behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The footprints were gone by the time I reached the edge of the woods, but the feeling of being watched never left. As I ran toward the road, I kept hearing that thud again, the same one I'd heard on the door. It was as if whatever had been outside had been following me, waiting for me to make my escape. I didn't stop until I reached the first sign of civilization, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching. I'd been looking forward to the weekend getaway for months, a chance to unplug, escape the chaos of city life, and take a breather from work. The cabin was tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a few hours from any significant town. It had been listed as a quiet, secluded spot with stunning views of the surrounding forest. That's exactly what I needed: peace and quiet. I was in my late 20s, just fresh off a stressful couple of months at my job, and I'd recently moved into a new place, so I needed a break from everything. The cabin was the perfect solution. A rustic little place, barely 100 square feet, but it seemed to promise solitude and freedom from the outside world. The drive there wasn't easy. I'd taken a long, winding road that twisted up the mountain, the trees pressing in on all sides. The GPS had long stopped working, but I wasn't concerned. I had the directions written down on paper, and I'd been given a couple of phone numbers for emergencies. As the sun dipped lower and lower, I could feel a strange sense of excitement building up in my chest. I was going to be all alone for the weekend, and I wasn't sure if that was exactly comforting or a little unnerving. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already dark. I pulled up to the gravel driveway, stepping out of my car and inhaling deeply. The air was crisp, a chill settling in as the night began to stretch out. The cabin was small, but it looked inviting with the porch light glowing warmly, casting a soft light on the wooden exterior. The whole place was surrounded by trees, thick forest that seemed to go on forever. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was small, just a living room with a fireplace, a small kitchen in the corner, and a loft above that looked like it held a bed. The cabin smelled of old wood, pine, and something earthy, like it hadn't been touched in years, but not in a bad way. I dropped my bag by the door and started to unpack, the silence wrapping around me, almost suffocating in its stillness. I spent the first night relaxing, taking a long, hot shower, and making a simple dinner of canned soup and bread. As I ate, I looked out the small window, the trees outside barely visible in the dark. It was hard to shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it away. I had no reason to be nervous. Everything about the cabin screamed peaceful retreat. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun wasn't quite up, but there was a strange lightness in the air, as though the dawn was about to break. I had a cup of coffee while sitting at the small wooden table by the window. I wasn't in a rush, just soaking up the calm, the feeling of isolation. I decided to take a walk around the area. I had read in the online reviews that there was a small lake nearby, so I figured I'd head that way. The forest was dense, the trees towering high above, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I followed a narrow path that wound through the woods, careful to stay on track so I wouldn't get lost. The air was cool, fresh, and every now and then, I'd hear the sound of a bird or a distant rustle, but mostly, it was eerily quiet. About half an hour into the walk, I reached the lake. The water was still, reflecting the overcast sky like a giant mirror. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. The trees around the lake seemed too thick, too close together. I felt like I was being watched, even though I knew there was no one around. I shrugged off the feeling and took a seat on a large rock by the shore. I had the entire place to myself, and I let out a long breath, trying to relax. That's when I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks stacked on top of each other near the edge of the lake. It wasn't much, but it looked unnatural, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I knelt down, curious, but a chill ran through me as I touched the rocks. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt wrong about the whole thing. I quickly stood up and backed away, my nerves spiking. I headed back to the cabin, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in my chest. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just letting the isolation get to me. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door and spent the rest of the afternoon pacing around. I didn't want to be outside anymore. The weird feeling lingered, gnawing at me. As night fell, I decided to cook something a little more substantial. Pasta with some of the canned vegetables I'd brought. I was sitting down to eat when I heard it, a soft thud against the cabin door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch falling on the roof. But then it happened again. Thud, thud. My heart started to race. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stood up from the table slowly, walking cautiously to the door. I stood there for a moment, just listening. Nothing. I checked the locks, double-checked them even, and then stood there, straining my ears. Then I heard it, a soft scraping noise from the back of the cabin. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to investigate, but some primal instinct forced me to move. I grabbed a flashlight and crept quietly to the back door. The night outside was pitch black, the trees swaying gently, nothing unusual, but my pulse was pounding in my ears. I shined the flashlight around, sweeping it across the small yard. That's when I saw it. A set of footprints in the dirt, fresh, leading from the trees to the back of the cabin. They weren't animal prints. These were human, barefoot. The blood drained from my face. I backed away slowly, then hurried back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I tried the landline, nothing. No connection, no way to reach anyone. The thudding sound came again, closer this time. I could hear it against the walls like someone was walking outside, but no one was there. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, listening, terrified, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of here, but I couldn't risk stepping outside. I spent the night hiding in the loft, clutching the flashlight, waiting for morning. I didn't sleep at all. I heard noises throughout the night, soft whispers in the wind, scraping sounds against the wood. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things in a hurry and left without looking back. I didn't care if I left some of my stuff behind. I just had to get out. I made my way down the mountain, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, and even then, I was too scared to relax. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not right away. I just wanted to forget it all. The weird thing, when I went back a few weeks later to check on the cabin, mainly to get my stuff, there were no footprints, no signs anyone had been there. The cabin was exactly as I left it, but I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw. Some things I guess you just can't explain. I'd been working as a park ranger for about 2 years, and in that time I'd gotten pretty comfortable with the routines and the quiet that came with working in the middle of nowhere. The park I worked in was called Timber Ridge, a vast forested area in the Rocky Mountains. It was far enough off the beaten path that most people stayed away, which suited me just fine. The park's history was quiet, No haunted tales or strange legends. Just nature, wildlife, and the occasional lost hiker. Nothing out of the ordinary. That particular evening in late October, the weather had shifted rapidly. 1 minute, the sky was clear, the sun sinking into the horizon. The next, dark clouds rolled in faster than I could have anticipated, blanketing the area in an eerie gray mist. The forecast had predicted rain, but this was different. It wasn't just the storm, it was the silence. There were no sounds of wildlife. The birds, the rustling leaves, even the chirping insects. Everything had fallen unnaturally still. I'd been alone at the ranger station, my small cabin tucked away on the far edge of the park. I liked the solitude, but on nights like this, it felt almost suffocating. I checked the radio for any weather updates, but the static coming through the speakers was disorienting, crackling with a heavy hiss. It wasn't unusual for the reception to be spotty, especially with a storm rolling in, but something about the way the air felt made my skin prickle with unease. I closed the windows and made sure the shutters were secure. The wind was picking up, gusting through the trees with an intensity one hadn't expected. As I moved through the small cabin, a sudden gust rattled the door. I glanced at the clock. 6:15 p.m. Early for the storm to have this much of a bite, but the shift had already begun, and I wasn't in a hurry to be caught out in it. The thought of sitting in the cabin alone for hours, waiting for the storm to pass, didn't sound appealing. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket, stepped out onto the porch, and locked the door behind me. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, the towering pines casting long, jagged shadows in the twilight. There was a small trail that wound through the trees nearby, a path I often walked when I needed some air. Tonight, though, the trail seemed to lead into something deeper, something unknown. As I walked, the rain started to fall, soft at first, then heavier, the drops tapping on the ground like someone gently knocking on the earth's surface. But the rain wasn't the most unsettling part. It was the sound that followed it. The sound of something moving in the trees. It was subtle, almost like a crackling, but it wasn't the wind. It was as if something was pushing its way through the underbrush, just out of sight. I quickened my pace, though I wasn't sure why. Something about the way the shadows in the woods shifted made my stomach twist. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it, a figure. At first, I thought it was another park ranger, maybe someone coming to check on things, but the more I looked, the more something didn't sit right. The figure stood in the trees just off the path, too still to be natural. They were tall, wearing dark clothing, their face obscured by the shadows of the trees. The first instinct I had was to call out, but the words froze on my tongue. I didn't know who or what that figure was, and something told me that if I spoke, it would hear me. I stood there for a long moment, the rain now coming down in sheets, obscuring everything in a haze of water. The figure remained motionless. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, a thudding reminder that I was alone, deep in the woods, with no help in sight. The silence was almost unbearable, the only sound the heavy patter of the rain. Slowly, cautiously, I took a step forward, trying to stay quiet. The figure didn't move. I was about to take another step when I heard a sound behind me, a snapping of twigs. My heart jumped into my chest. I turned sharply, my flashlight casting a weak beam into the woods. Nothing, just trees, wet earth, and the rain. I turned back to where the figure had been standing, but it was gone. The air felt suddenly thicker, heavier. I wasn't alone, I realized, but the feeling wasn't like the usual wildlife encounters I'd gotten used to. This was something different. I didn't wait for whatever it was to show itself again. I turned on my heel and headed back down the path, trying to maintain a calm pace. But with every step, I felt like I was being followed. The weight of it, the pressure on my chest, was unbearable. I could hear the faint rustling of movement behind me, soft but distinct. It wasn't the wind. I reached the cabin as quickly as I could, slamming the door behind me as soon as I was inside. I locked it, then leaned against the wooden frame, breathing hard. The cabin felt too small, too confining now, the walls closing in around me. I grabbed the radio again, trying to get some sort of signal, but the static only grew louder, more intense. I sat on the couch, flashlight in hand, waiting for something to happen. I kept listening for the sounds from outside, the movement in the trees. The rain continued to beat down relentlessly, but now it felt like the storm wasn't the only thing battering the cabin. It was as if something was waiting out there, watching. Around midnight, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees, but it was the pounding at the door that made me freeze. It wasn't a knock. It was heavy, forceful, like someone or something was trying to break it down. I grabbed my radio once more, but this time, it wasn't static I heard. A voice, distorted, faint, but unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear. Someone was on the other end. My fingers trembled as I pressed the button to respond. "Hello," I said, my voice weak, almost drowned by the noise of the storm. No answer, just the same static, then silence. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling, the deep, gut-wrenching sensation that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until the morning light broke through the storm that I dared venture outside again. The rain had stopped, the wind gone silent. The woods were still, almost too still. I walked cautiously to the area where I had seen the figure. There were no tracks, no signs of disturbance, nothing that could explain what had happened the night before. But in the distance, near the edge of the trees, I noticed something strange. A small object partially buried in the dirt. I crouched down, brushing away the wet earth, revealing a set of keys. A keychain, simple but with an odd symbol engraved into it. I didn't know where they came from or why they had been left there, but in that moment, I knew something had changed. Timber Ridge wasn't the same anymore, and neither was I. I returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me once again. The keys went into my drawer, and I didn't speak of the night to anyone. I never did, but from that day forward, I kept an eye on the woods, because no matter how many years I spent working in the park, I knew now that there were things out there, things we weren't meant to understand, and some mysteries were better left alone. The evening had already begun to draw its thick, oppressive shadows by the time I reached the cabin. The year was 1998, and the forest around me seemed endless, every tree standing as a silent sentinel. I was in the middle of nowhere in the Adirondacks, some 20 miles away from the nearest road, and the only thing I could hear was the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots and the occasional bird call. I was supposed to meet some friends here, but things had fallen through, and I ended up coming alone. Honestly, I didn't mind. I liked the quiet, the solitude. It had always helped me clear my mind. The cabin, when I first saw it, looked exactly as I had imagined it. Small, tucked away in a clearing, with a rusted tin roof and dark, wooden beams. It was the kind of place that had seen better days but still had a sort of charm to it. Maybe it was the fact that it stood at the edge of the forest, as if daring anyone to venture into its depths. Maybe it was the peeling paint on the walls, or the crooked shutters that rattled slightly in the wind. Whatever it was, I knew this was the right spot. I unlocked the front door with the key I found in my bag and stepped inside, the creak of the hinges filling the air. The inside was a far cry from the worn-down exterior. There were a few faded rugs on the floor, an old stone fireplace with a few logs stacked neatly by the side, and a heavy oak table in the center of the room. The kitchen, though modest, had everything I would need. A small fridge, a stove, a microwave, and some dusty cabinets stocked with canned food. A lantern sat on a side table near the front door, its wick already soaked, ready to be lit. I smiled, feeling an odd sense of comfort. After setting my bags down, I decided to explore the property. The cabin sat on about 5 acres of land, surrounded by dense trees. The kind of trees that looked older than time itself, their branches twisting in strange directions. The area around the cabin had been cleared of underbrush, but beyond that, the woods were thick and dark, almost suffocating. I wandered down a trail that looked like it had been used often, until I stumbled upon a small creek that cut through the land. The water was crystal clear, but the rocks along the edge were slick with moss, and the air had a chill to it that made me shiver slightly. I hadn't noticed how quickly the day was fading until the sun dipped behind the trees, casting everything in a cold, gray light. As I made my way back to the cabin, a feeling of unease settled over me. I had never been one to be easily spooked, but something about this place was off. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched unnaturally long, or how quiet everything had become. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. The moment I stepped back inside, I felt it again. The silence was too thick. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was watching me. It wasn't just a passing thought either. It was as if every corner of the room was alive with a quiet tension, like the house itself was holding its breath. I lit the lantern and settled down in front of the fireplace, deciding to make some dinner. As the fire crackled, I tried to push the unsettling feeling out of my mind. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, but no matter how much I tried to distract myself with cooking, the sense of unease only grew. By the time night had fully descended, I felt it, like a weight on my chest. The cabin was still, too still. I glanced around, the shadows from the lantern flickering on the walls like living things. My heart began to race. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. I tried to shake it off, but then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound at the back door. My blood ran cold. I told myself it was just a branch brushing against the wood, or maybe a raccoon rummaging around outside. But the sound didn't stop, kept going, slow and deliberate, like whatever was making it knew I was inside. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. My mind raced, but I couldn't form a coherent thought. Was it a person? I told myself no one lived for miles around. And yet, the noise persisted. It wasn't the wind. The scratching had a rhythm, like claws against wood. The lantern flickered, its light dimming slightly. My chest tightened. I glanced toward the back door. I could hear it just outside, moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and moved cautiously toward the door. The light from the lantern barely reached the edges of the room. My hands were shaking as I turned the handle, slowly pulling the door open. The moment the door cracked, I froze. The air outside was cold and thick with humidity, the kind that only comes after a storm. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the forest shrouded in complete darkness. The only sound now was my own breath and the beating of my heart, heavy in my ears. The scratching had stopped. The forest was eerily quiet. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight in every direction. The beams sliced through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. No animal, no person, nothing that could explain the noise. My breath came in shallow bursts as I scanned the area, feeling an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. Then I saw it. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, I caught a glimpse of movement too fast, too unnatural. Something dark shifted among the trees, just on the edge of the light's reach. My instincts screamed at me to run, to lock myself back inside, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as if something was pulling me in, making me watch, making me feel as though I had no choice but to stay. A low, growling sound broke the silence. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a loose rock. I didn't need to see it fully. I already knew what it was. That low, guttural growl was enough to tell me this was no animal I'd ever encountered. I was too far out, too isolated. No one would hear me if I screamed. I turned and bolted back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. The growl echoed in my mind, and I could hear something pacing just outside. I was paralyzed, the weight of the night sinking deeper with every passing second. There was something out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time seemed to lose meaning as I huddled by the fire, trying to steady my breath. The sounds outside had faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. The isolation was complete. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, the sun was already high in the sky. I stepped outside cautiously, expecting to see some sign of what had happened, but the clearing was calm. The birds were chirping, and everything looked normal, as though the events of the night had been nothing more than a nightmare. But I knew better. I packed up and left the cabin that morning, and I never went back. There's a part of me that still wonders what I saw that night, but I'll never find out. Some things are better left untouched. Some places are better left undisturbed. I had always heard rumors about the old cabin in the woods, but I never thought much of them. People around here talked about it as if it was cursed, but they'd never really given any solid reason why. It wasn't anything special, just a cabin, abandoned for years. I figured I could spend a weekend away from everyone, get some peace, and maybe even explore the place for myself. So one evening in the fall of 2016, I packed a bag, grabbed my dog, and drove out to the cabin. I wasn't sure what to expect, but the thought of spending a weekend in solitude sounded perfect. The drive there wasn't long, only about 2 hours from where I lived. I'd heard the stories from locals, the ones that said the place was haunted or cursed, that strange noises echoed from it at night. But I figured they were just tales to scare people. Everyone in this part of the country loved telling ghost stories to tourists. I was in my mid-20s at the time, and like any skeptical person, I brushed off the eerie chatter. As I made my way down the narrow road leading to the cabin, I could already feel the change in the air. The trees, mostly bare now, seemed to swallow the light, casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt path. My dog, a mixed breed named Max, whined softly in the back seat. His ears perked up. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Max wasn't the kind of dog to get skittish easily, so his anxiety set me on edge a little. Still, I told myself it was just the new surroundings. I pulled up to the cabin just as the sun was setting. It was an old, weather-beaten structure, barely standing tall in the overgrown grass. The roof had holes, and one of the windows was cracked open, swaying slightly in the wind. The door, barely hanging onto its hinges, creaked every time the breeze pushed against it. The place smelled of mildew and rotting wood, but there was something oddly inviting about it. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just the fact that I was finally somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts. I grabbed my bag from the car, locking the doors behind me. Max jumped out and immediately ran around the yard, sniffing at the tall grass and weeds that had taken over the area. The surrounding woods felt unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence that pressed down on me. I pushed the thought aside and made my way inside. The floorboards creaked loudly under my boots as I stepped into the cabin. It was dusty, the air thick with years of neglect. The furniture, what was left of it, was covered in sheets, as if the previous owners had left in a hurry, never to return. The only light came from the fading sunlight streaming through the cracks in the walls. Max wandered off to explore the corner of the room while I set down my bag and began to unpack. The first hour or so wasn't bad. I started a small fire in the fireplace to keep the chill at bay, made myself a simple dinner, and even managed to get a couple of decent photos of the place. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere around the cabin started to shift. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls, and the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. Max began to grow increasingly agitated, pacing back and forth, whining softly. I figured he was just nervous, but there was something unsettling about his behavior. I decided to go outside for a bit to clear my head. The moon had risen now, casting an eerie glow over the woods. It felt like I was standing on the edge of the world, completely isolated from everything. The cabin, though old and dilapidated, had its own strange charm in the moonlight. I stood there for a moment, just looking out at the trees, when I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too close. I spun around, trying to peer through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Max was now standing at my side, his body tense, his tail between his legs. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a branch breaking in the wind, but the rustling continued, now closer, moving in the direction of the cabin. My heart started to beat faster as I scanned the trees, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then, as if on cue, I saw it. A shadow, low to the ground, moving quickly between the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Too fast, too smooth, like it wasn't entirely of this world. Max barked suddenly, his growl deep and threatening, pulling me out of my daze. I grabbed his collar and pulled him back toward the cabin, locking the door behind us. I wasn't sure what I had just seen, but my instincts screamed that something wasn't right. The rest of the night was spent in a state of unease. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the sounds of the forest outside seemed to grow louder. The wind, the rustling, and that strange feeling that I was being watched. Max refused to lie down, instead pacing around the cabin, his nose twitching at every corner. I couldn't help but feel the same, like there was something out there, just waiting for me to slip up. Around 2 a.m., I heard a thud coming from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of something. Someone scratching at the door. My blood ran cold. Max's barking grew frantic, and I stood frozen in place, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. It sounded like nails dragging across the wooden door frame, slow and deliberate. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide. It wanted me to know it was there. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from my bag and approached the door cautiously, Max's growls echoing in my ears. I shined the light through the cracks, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly the scratching stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, heart pounding, listening to the silence. Finally, I opened the door just enough to peek outside. The yard was empty. There was no sign of anything moving, no strange shadows in the trees, just the dark, empty woods stretching out in every direction. I stepped outside, Max at my heels, and scanned the area. My heart was still racing, but I told myself that it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a bear or something that had gotten too close. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. There was something out there, something that wasn't natural. I decided to leave the next morning. The sense of dread had only grown stronger overnight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. By the time dawn broke, I packed my things and got in the car, not even bothering to look back at the cabin. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel a weight lifting off my shoulders. but something stuck with me. That strange, lingering feeling that the woods had changed me. Maybe it was just the isolation or the fear, but I couldn't shake the sense that the cabin wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting, and it knew I was there. To this day, I don't go near that cabin. I don't even drive on that road anymore. It's not just the cabin that scares me. It's the fact that, deep down, I know whatever I felt that night wasn't a figment of my imagination. Something was out there, something I'll never understand, and I'm better off leaving it alone. The cabin stood like a lone monument against the backdrop of an overcast sky, perched on the edge of a forgotten farm. Its once charming wooden walls were worn and cracked, as if they had endured decades of neglect. The farm had been abandoned for years, the fields long overtaken by wild grass, the fences rotting where the earth had swallowed them. The cabin, at least, had some semblance of structure left, and that's why I was here. I was 28, newly divorced, with little more than a few things packed in the back of my old truck. I'd decided to take a break from everything, hoping the silence and isolation of the countryside would be enough to heal the bruises on my soul. It had been a rough few months, and the thought of being in a place where no one could find me was appealing. When I arrived, it felt like stepping into another time. The place was a mess, but a kind of peaceful mess. The wooden floors creaked beneath my boots as I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of dust and mildew. A few cobwebs clung to the corners, and the furniture inside was old. An armchair in front of a small stone fireplace, a kitchen table covered in grime, a small fridge that hummed faintly in the corner. There were no signs of recent activity, no trace of anyone else for miles. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the next few hours unpacking and cleaning, trying to make the place feel a bit more like home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I went out to the small porch at the front of the cabin, sitting in a creaky rocking chair to watch the last slivers of daylight fade into night. The air was cool, but not too cold. The world around me was still, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. That night, after settling in, I went to bed early. I wasn't expecting any visitors or distractions, just a long night of sleep. But the quiet of the place felt oppressive, heavy in a way that I couldn't shake. I kept hearing noises outside, just beyond the walls of the cabin. Footsteps, a scraping sound against the porch, the soft thud of something moving in the grass. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just animals. Maybe a deer or a raccoon sniffing around the trash I had left out earlier. But the noises persisted, growing more insistent. I could feel my heart rate increase as I lay there in the dark, listening. The sound of the scraping grew louder, moving along the porch toward the front door. It was slow, deliberate. I couldn't help but feel a tight knot form in my stomach. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them seemed to make sense. I pushed the blankets off of me, my bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor as I quietly stood up. I crept over to the window, peering out into the night. The porch light was off, but the moonlight illuminated the surroundings enough for me to make out vague shapes in the yard. There was nothing there. Still, the sounds continued. I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck, my body tense as I waited for whatever was outside to make itself known. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I waited, barely breathing, my eyes fixed on the dark outline of the porch, but nothing moved. I had to know what it was. I grabbed the flashlight that I had left on the counter and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The porch creaked beneath my weight as I walked slowly toward the edge. I scanned the yard, the light from my flashlight darting over the dark shapes of the trees and the tall, unkempt grass. Still nothing. I hesitated for a moment, then turned to the side of the cabin where the woods began. I had the strange sense that something was watching me from the shadows. I hadn't heard any footsteps behind me, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I saw it. A shape moving through the trees. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its movements were jerky, as though it was unfamiliar with how its body worked. It was hunched over, and it had long, thin limbs that stretched out far too far. My heart skipped a beat, a surge of adrenaline pumping through my veins. I stepped back toward the cabin, but my foot caught on something, perhaps an old log or a broken fence post, and I stumbled. The creature, or whatever it was, immediately stopped, turning its head toward me with a sharp, unnatural motion. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, yellowish, almost animal-like, but wide and unnatural. I didn't wait to see any more. I bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My breath came in short gasps as I backed away from the door, my mind racing. My thoughts were scattered, and I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. I moved to the window again, cautiously pulling back the curtain. The creature was still there, standing perfectly still just outside the edge of the trees. It didn't move for what felt like an eternity, and I didn't dare take my eyes off of it. The light from the flashlight had long since disappeared, but the moonlight was enough to reveal that it hadn't gone anywhere. I couldn't stay here. I knew that much. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no one around to help me if something went wrong. But the thought of leaving in the dead of night, with that thing out there, made me freeze in place. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. I grabbed my keys and rushed outside, keeping as low to the ground as possible, praying that the creature didn't hear me. The truck's engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the night. I floored the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt road away from the cabin as fast as I could. My hands shook on the wheel, my breath ragged as I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. But when I looked back, there was nothing. I drove for what seemed like forever, not stopping until I reached a small town several miles away. I parked in front of a gas station, the lights harsh in the otherwise dark street. That night, I didn't sleep. Couldn't. My mind kept replaying the image of the creature standing in the woods. I don't know what it was or why it was there, but I knew one thing for sure. It was real. The next day, I drove back to the cabin to get my things. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly as I had left it. The woods were still, the grass undisturbed. Nothing was out of place, nothing to suggest that what I had seen was anything but a figment of my imagination. But I knew better. I'd seen it. It was real, and I couldn't bring myself to stay there a moment longer. I left the keys on the counter and walked out the door for the last time, not looking back. The wind was howling outside the cabin, pushing against the walls like it had a mind of its own. The kind of night where everything felt heavier, colder, like the world was bracing itself for something, though I didn't know what that something was. I had rented the cabin through a small agency in the countryside of Wales, a place to escape the buzz of city life. It was late October, the air thick with fog, and the sun had dipped behind the hills hours ago, leaving the world to be consumed by darkness. I was alone, except for my dog, Rex, a German shepherd who was more a companion than a pet. I thought a few days out in the middle of nowhere would clear my head, help me recover from the stress of work and the breakup with Jenny. I needed space to think, to breathe, and the isolation was a welcome change from my usual hectic routine. The cabin was modest but comfortable. Small, really, just a single room with a bed, a wood stove, and a few chairs. There was a rustic charm to it, the kind of place where you could hear every creak of the floorboards, every crack of the firewood burning in the stove. But that night, as the shadows grew long and the wind rattled the windows, something felt off. something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Rex had been on edge for hours, pacing the cabin and growling low under his breath. It wasn't like him to act this way. I had spent enough time with him to know when something was bothering him. But every time I tried to get him to settle down, he'd just look at me with those wide, alert eyes and growl again, more insistently this time. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Maybe it was the isolation that had begun to play tricks on me, or maybe I was just tired of sitting around, but the thought of walking out in the cool, damp air was oddly comforting. Rex, of course, insisted on coming with me. He wasn't the kind of dog to let me go anywhere alone. We stepped outside, the gravel crunching under our boots as we made our way down the narrow path that led to the edge of the woods. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches swaying in the gusting wind. The fog was thick, like a blanket that muffled everything. I could barely make out the faint outline of the cabin behind us. We walked for a while, Rex sticking close by my side, his ears pricked, sniffing the air. My thoughts wandered, and for the first time in days, I felt a slight sense of peace. The stillness was almost meditative, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the howl of the wind. But then, in the distance, I saw something, a figure, standing in the woods. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog. But as we got closer, it became clear. A woman. She was standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, staring directly at me. My heart rate quickened as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. She was wearing a long, dark coat, the kind that might have been fashionable years ago, but it looked out of place in this setting. Her hair was long, dark, and unkempt, hanging over her shoulders in tangled waves. But what struck me most was her face. Pale, almost unnaturally so, with sharp features that seemed to sink in at the edges. Her eyes were dark, wide, and unblinking, fixed on me like I was the only thing in her world. Rex let out a low growl, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. He was trembling, refusing to move any closer. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to call out to her, but something held me back. Something about her stillness, her eerie silence, made me hesitate. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking slightly more than I wanted it to. There was no response, no movement, just her staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look at her, but Rex pulled back, tugging at the leash with surprising strength. I glanced down at him, then back at the woman, and for a split second, I thought I saw her lips move. Not in speech, but in a strange, almost imperceptible way, as if she was mouthing something. The moment was enough to make me shiver, a coldness creeping over me that had nothing to do with the weather. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence again. Still no response. I began to feel this overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. It was like being caught in a nightmare where you knew you should run, but your body refused to move. Rex was now barking wildly, yanking against the leash. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to get away from her. I turned quickly, tugging Rex by the collar as I started to back away. But as I did, I heard something. A voice, soft and hoarse, drifting through the fog. "Leave now," she whispered. The words sent a chill straight to my bones. I didn't look back, but I could feel her presence behind me, following us, watching us as we moved. The growl of the wind seemed to grow louder, almost like it was pushing me, urging me to run faster. I glanced over my shoulder just once, catching a glimpse of her standing there in the fog, her face still hauntingly unreadable. We didn't stop until we were back at the cabin. I slammed the door behind us, locking it with trembling hands. Rex was panting heavily, his fur bristling. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls too close. I tried to tell myself I was just spooked, that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the door, listening to the sound of the wind outside. But I never heard her again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into an uneasy sleep, plagued by dreams of a dark figure watching me from the woods. The next morning, I was on edge. I had to leave. I packed up everything quickly, not caring about the mess I left behind. Rex was restless too, pacing back and forth as if he understood that something wasn't right. I could hear the wind howling outside again, but there was no sign of the woman, no trace of anything out of the ordinary. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin in my rearview mirror. It stood there, dark and silent, just like it had the night before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it wasn't completely empty. I never went back. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A break from the constant grind of work and daily life was exactly what I needed. A cabin in the middle of the woods in northern New Mexico seemed perfect, just far enough from town to offer peace, but still close enough in case I needed supplies. It was a small old cabin I had found on an online rental site. It wasn't much, barely more than a shack, but it was secluded, and that was exactly what I wanted. I packed up my things, grabbed my dog Max, and hit the road. The journey was long, but I was in no rush. I figured the isolation would be refreshing, even if I had to drive down some winding, dirt roads to get there. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The cabin sat at the base of a steep hill, surrounded by dense trees. The place had character: creaky floors, a rusty stove, and an old wood-burning fireplace. But it also had an unsettling silence. The kind of silence that you know isn't just from the lack of noise, but from the stillness of everything around you. Max, my golden retriever, was already sniffing around, his tail wagging but his ears twitching as if he sensed something I couldn't. I didn't think much of it. Animals sometimes get odd when they're in a new place, especially when it's as remote as this. I unpacked my bags and made a fire. The warmth from the flames filled the small living room, and soon the cabin felt cozier. But as night fell, I started to hear things. Little creaks and groans from the wood, the wind rattling the windows, and more unnervingly, faint rustling noises just outside. Max started growling low in his throat, his fur bristling. I called him over, telling him it was probably just a squirrel or something, but deep down I wasn't sure. There was something off about the way the wind sounded. Too sharp, too sudden, like it was pushing against something it shouldn't be. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Max seemed to sense it too. He was on edge, pacing around the room, whining occasionally. I thought about going outside to check, but the idea of stepping out into the darkness alone, with no one around for miles, felt unsettling. Around midnight, I heard something that made my heart race. A knock, but not on the door, on the window, followed by a soft scratching sound. My first thought was that someone had come to find me, but the more I listened, the more it felt wrong. There was no car, no sign of anyone nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the window. Max barked suddenly, startling me, and I spun around. That's when I saw it. Standing in the shadow of the cabin, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam, was a figure. A man, or at least it looked like a man. But something was horribly off. His limbs were unnaturally long, and his posture was twisted in a way that didn't make sense. The more I stared, the more I realized that the figure wasn't just tall. It was bent. Its movements were jerky, almost animalistic, like it was trying to imitate a human but failing. Max growled again, his fur standing on end. I quickly backed away from the window, my mind racing. I thought about calling the police, but who would be able to get here in time? And why hadn't I heard a car? Any sign of someone driving up? The figure stood there for what felt like hours, unmoving, staring at the cabin. Every time I moved, it seemed to shift slightly, like it was adjusting its position to follow me. I didn't dare make a sound, didn't even want to breathe too loudly. I watched it through the crack in the curtains, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it wasn't a person. No person stood like that. No person moved like that. It was something else, something wrong. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The silence returned, even more suffocating than before. My mind screamed at me to do something. Lock the door, go outside, or run. But I was frozen, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me not to move, to stay hidden. The hours dragged on, and I finally fell into a fitful sleep on the couch. The fire long since burned out, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I woke up more than once, hearing soft, deliberate scratching at the door. Max slept at my feet, but every now and then, he would wake up, stand, and growl softly before lying back down. When the sun finally rose, I felt a little better, but I knew I couldn't just stay there, trapped in that cabin. I decided to head back into town, even if it meant leaving early. As I packed up, I kept my eyes on the woods around me, half expecting to see the figure lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing. I loaded Max into the car and started the drive out. The road was bumpy, winding, and made it hard to see much in the rearview mirror, but I was so relieved to be leaving that I didn't care. But as I rounded a bend in the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing by the side of the road, was the same figure. Its eyes were fixed on me, the same unsettling, twisted posture. This time, though, it was clear what it was. The figure wasn't just mimicking a person. It was a skinwalker, an abomination in the form of a human, but with the soul of something else entirely. It was the thing the Navajo warned about, a creature that could wear the skin of others and walk among us, hiding in plain sight. I didn't stop to think. My foot slammed on the accelerator, and I sped past the figure, not daring to look back. The car bounced along the rough road, but I didn't slow down until I was safely back in town, a good distance away from that cursed cabin. Max was quiet the entire ride back. It was as if he knew the danger, too. When I finally reached the rental office to drop off the keys, I couldn't shake the image of the skinwalker from my mind. I asked the office clerk if anyone else had rented that cabin recently. She looked at me like I was crazy, but when I pressed her, she said that a man had disappeared in those woods years ago, a local who had gone missing without a trace. Some people said he was taken by something in the woods. Others said he was a skinwalker, and it was the forest's way of claiming him back. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I don't know if the creature was waiting for me specifically, or if it was just an unfortunate coincidence. But I've learned that some things aren't meant to be seen, and some places are better left undisturbed. I'll take my chances with civilization from now on. At least there, I know I'm not being watched. I had been looking forward to the hunting trip for weeks. It had been a rough year, and the stress of work and life in general was starting to catch up with me. So, when I got the chance to join some old college friends for a weekend at a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan, I didn't hesitate. The cabin was isolated, a small log structure surrounded by towering pines, miles away from the nearest town. It sounded like exactly what I needed, a quiet escape from everything. We arrived late Friday afternoon. The weather had been unseasonably warm for late October, but as we got closer to the cabin, the air turned cooler and the forest seemed denser. Felt like stepping into another world. the kind of world where time slowed down and nature ruled everything. There was no signal out here, no Wi-Fi, nothing to distract us from the wild around us. The cabin was small but sturdy, built with rough-hewn logs, the kind you could tell had been crafted with care. It sat at the edge of a clearing, nestled beside a creek that babbled its way through the forest. The roof was steep and covered in old shingles, and the front porch creaked underfoot when we stepped onto it. Inside, it was simple but cozy, old furniture, a wood stove for heat, and a handful of supplies neatly stacked in the corner. A hunting rifle leaned against the wall, the only sign of anything remotely dangerous nearby. There were 5 of us, me, my 2 friends, Nate and Brian, and their 2 cousins, Sean and Kyle. All of us were experienced hunters, though none of us were particularly looking for a big game. We were here more for the experience, to disconnect, have some beers, and maybe get lucky with a deer or 2. That first night, after unpacking our gear, we settled around the fireplace. The flickering light of the flames cast long shadows on the walls, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin, aside from the occasional pop of burning wood. We ate a simple dinner of canned stew and bread, washed down with whiskey and beer. The conversation came easy, stories from our college days, some laughs, a few quiet moments as we all drifted into our thoughts. At some point, Kyle mentioned that he'd heard some odd things about the area around the cabin. Something about strange noises at night and the occasional sighting of something unnatural in the woods. Everyone laughed it off, including me. You hear stories like that all the time in these parts. Local legends, spooky tales people tell to scare each other. Still, there was something in the way he said it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As the night wore on, I went outside to take a leak. The cool night air hit me hard as I stepped off the porch, and I couldn't help but feel that the silence out here was different from what I was used to. There were no crickets, no distant howls from coyotes, nothing. Just an eerie quiet that seemed to swallow any sound I made. I finished and stood there for a moment, staring into the blackness beyond the cabin. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their tops barely visible under the moonlight. A chill ran through me, but I brushed it off and headed back inside. The night passed without incident, though I slept restlessly. There was something about the place that gnawed at me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The next day, we geared up early and set out into the woods. The sun had barely risen, and the mist still clung to the ground like a shroud. We spread out in different directions, each of us following trails that we hoped would lead to a decent hunt. The woods were quiet, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional call of a bird overhead. I was deep into the woods, following a trail that seemed to get narrower and more difficult to navigate, when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A soft rustling, like the movement of something large through the underbrush. It was too far away to be a bear, too slow to be a deer. And then there was a snap of a twig, too close, followed by another. My heart started racing. I slowly reached for the rifle slung across my back, my eyes scanning the trees around me. Whatever it wasn't moving like any animal I knew. It was deliberate, quiet, methodical. I waited, breath held, trying to gauge the direction of the sounds. Nothing, just the wind. I kept moving a little faster now, my senses on high alert. I could feel something was off, but I pushed it down. Maybe it was just my nerves. Eventually, I met up with the others at the edge of the woods. They hadn't seen anything, and none of them had heard anything strange. I didn't tell them about the noise. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time, just my imagination playing tricks on me. We spent the rest of the day hunting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching us. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense up. By the time we returned to the cabin, I was on edge. The light was fading, and a sense of unease settled over me. That night, as we sat around the fire, The conversation took a darker turn. Cal brought up the stories again, about people going missing in the woods, strange sightings, things that didn't make sense. At first, I thought he was just trying to freak us out. But then he told us about an old hunter he'd met once who had lived in the area years ago. The man had told him about something he'd seen. A large figure, taller than any man, moving through the woods at night. Something not quite human. The whole room fell silent. The fire crackled, and the wind outside howled like a living thing. I could see it in everyone's eyes now, the same unease I felt earlier in the day. We all tried to laugh it off, but the tension was palpable. I went to bed early that night, hoping to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled louder than before, rattling the old windows. I rolled over, trying to block out the noise, but it kept me awake, gnawing at my mind. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside, soft at first, like footsteps in the snow. But there was no snow. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just an animal or the wind. But then the sound came again, closer this time. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I lay there in the dark, heart racing, listening. Then, the unmistakable sound of something or someone scratching at the wooden walls just above my head. I froze, too terrified to move, too scared to make a sound. I could feel the air in the room shift, the oppressive silence wrapping itself around me. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Then, a knock, hard, deliberate, on the front door. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did anyone else. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin early, too shaken to stay. The door showed no signs of damage, no tracks in the dirt around the cabin. But we all knew something had been out there. We never went back to that cabin. The wind howled through the trees outside, carrying the scent of wet earth and the sharp crispness of a fall night. I stood by the small window of the cabin, peering through the rain-streaked glass, watching the forest blur in the shadows. The cabin was supposed to be a getaway, a place to find peace and escape the noise of the world. But it was far from peaceful tonight. Something felt off. My dog, Max, a sturdy German shepherd, lay near the fire, his ears pricked up, eyes darting nervously toward the door. I tried to dismiss it. We'd been here for a few days, tucked away in a remote part of northern Washington state, away from everyone and everything. The cabin had been built by my late father. Simple, rustic, with wood paneling and a creaky floor that echoed every time you stepped on it. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, sending flickers of orange light dancing along the walls. It was cozy, but there was an unsettling quiet in the air. It wasn't the kind of silence you get when everything is calm, but the kind where every small sound feels like an intrusion. Max suddenly stood up, his nose twitching. He moved to the door and scratched at it, whimpering softly. I frowned, walking over to him. The only other sounds were the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. I opened the door a crack, peering out into the darkness. The porch light flickered once, and I saw nothing but trees swaying in the wind. It was too dark to see much more than that, and the rain obscured any details. Just a raccoon or something, I muttered to myself, though the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I closed the door, but Max remained by it, staring at the doorknob. I sighed, rubbing his ears. "It's fine, buddy. Nothing's out there." But I wasn't convinced. I grabbed a flashlight from the table and walked over to the back door, checking the locks. The heavy rain had created a strange rhythm, a constant drumming that filled my head with thoughts of things I'd rather not entertain. There were no neighbors for miles, just miles and miles of dense woods. I settled back into my chair, trying to distract myself with a book. Max, however, wouldn't settle. His low growl rumbled from his chest as he paced by the door again. Every now and then, he would stop and sniff the air, his ears straining toward something I couldn't hear. It had been peaceful earlier that day when we'd taken a walk through the woods. The forest had been alive with the sound of birds and insects, and the sun had filtered through the leaves in patches of gold. But now, in the evening, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, and the wind had shifted, blowing harder and colder than before. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was after midnight. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like a twig snapping underfoot. I froze. Max's growl turned into a sharp bark, his body tensing up as if he sensed something just beyond the door. I stood up slowly. The flashlight I had left on the table flickered and then went out. I cursed under my breath, reaching for another one. But before I could turn it on, the sound came again. A soft crunch, like footsteps on gravel. I stepped back toward the door, holding my breath. Max was already by the window, his eyes locked on something in the darkness. I could see nothing but the blurry outlines of trees and the shadowy silhouettes of bushes, swaying in the wind. I could feel my heart pounding now, and for a moment, I stood there, completely still. The noise stopped. Silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned toward the cabin's front door. The lock was still in place, but the door itself, just a little, had shifted. It was as though someone had pushed it slightly open. I held my breath and stepped toward it, my pulse quickening. Max whined softly as I reached for the knob. I opened the door, but no one was there. The night air was damp and cold, and the rain was coming down harder now. "Must be the wind," I muttered, closing the door behind me and bolting it again. But my gut told me it was something more than that. As I sat back down, trying to regain my composure, Max suddenly began barking furiously. His fur stood on end, his tail stiff as a board. I glanced toward the window again. This time there was someone, standing just beyond the tree line. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, but when I shone it toward the figure, it vanished. The darkness swallowed it up like a black hole. I rubbed my eyes. I had to be imagining things, but Max wasn't having it. He growled low, his body tense and poised for action. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, scraping against the wood of the cabin. Slowly, steadily, the noise came from the back of the house. I grabbed the nearest heavy object I could find, a small cast iron skillet from the kitchen, and made my way toward the back door. Max followed close behind, his body rigid, his gaze never leaving the door. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight toward the back of the cabin. There, at the edge of the tree line, I saw the faintest outline of a person, just a shadow barely visible in the downpour. I swallowed hard, but I didn't freeze. My instincts kicked in. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice shaky but firm. No answer, just the rustling of the wind and the rain. Max barked once more, a deep warning growl following after. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the skillet, and stepped forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I reached the edge of the porch, but when I shone the light into the woods, there was nothing there, just trees. The strange thing was the noise had stopped. The feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was just out of reach, had vanished. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but once again, nothing was there. I don't know how long I stood there, my mind racing, but when I finally gathered the courage to move back inside, the cabin was completely still. Max had stopped barking. The fire was still crackling in the hearth. The wind had died down. I bolted the door shut again, and this time, I didn't dare leave it unlocked. The tension in my chest slowly loosened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something. Max curled up next to the fire, his breathing steady, but his eyes still darted toward the door every so often, as if he knew something I didn't. The rest of the night passed without incident, and by morning, the sun had risen, casting a soft light over the wet trees. The woods seemed peaceful again, the sounds of birds returning to fill the silence. But I knew better. I wasn't alone out here, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be again. The first time I stepped foot in my grandmother's cabin, I wasn't prepared for the weight of its silence. The old place had always seemed a little off to me, even when she was alive. But after she passed, it became something else entirely. Something heavy, something cold. It was late October when I decided to go. The house was up in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest town. You couldn't see another house from the cabin, just miles of thick forest, with the occasional creek or rocky hill peeking through the trees. I'd gone there once with my brother when we were both kids, but that was over a decade ago before things went bad. It was a quiet morning when I packed my truck with a few essentials. Clothes, some food, my dog, Ellie, and a handful of tools I thought might come in handy. Ellie had always been a good companion, loyal and attentive. She was a German Shepherd, a bit older now, but still sharp as ever. I could tell she was nervous when I let her jump into the truck, but she trusted me. The drive up was long and winding. The roads were narrow, barely wide enough for one car, and the trees were already starting to lose their leaves, the ground littered with orange and yellow. It wasn't hard to see why Grandma had picked this place. It was isolated, peaceful, and back then, I imagined it had given her the kind of quiet she'd always loved. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly like I remembered. Small, wood-framed, with a big porch out front and a slanted roof that had always looked like it was sagging a little more than it should. The wooden steps creaked as I walked up to the door, and when I opened it, the smell hit me immediately. A stale, musty smell that made me gag. I hadn't been there in years, but the house had that distinct odor, a mixture of old wood, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. Ellie immediately ran inside, her paws clicking on the wooden floors, sniffing everything. I stood there for a moment, the silence pressing down on me. There was no wind outside, no animals chirping, nothing but the quiet. I come to clean up a bit, maybe take inventory of things, and figure out what to do with the cabin. Grandma had left everything to me, but I didn't really know what to do with it. I hadn't even thought about selling it until I got there and remembered how much work it needed. The whole place seemed to be falling apart at the seams. Cobwebs in the corners, the floorboards creaking under every step. It didn't help that I had this eerie feeling that something was off. I decided to start by opening the windows, letting some fresh air in. I went around the cabin, unlatching each window. That's when I noticed something odd. In the back bedroom, where Grandma had always kept her old rocking chair by the window, the curtain was still closed, tight, as if it hadn't been touched in years. I hadn't noticed before, but the room seemed darker than it should be, like something was blocking the light from getting in. Ellie started barking from the hallway, and I followed her. She was standing near the kitchen door, wagging her tail and whining. She didn't bark like that unless she was agitated. I opened the door slowly, and that's when I saw it. One of the kitchen chairs was pulled out, and it was facing the door, as though someone had been sitting there watching me. I froze. My heart beat faster. No one had been there. I was sure of it. I hadn't seen anyone in miles, and the cabin was locked up tight when I arrived. Ellie barked again, pulling at the leash I'd attached to her. I grabbed the chair and spun it around, expecting to find something, anything, that could explain the oddity. But there was nothing. The room was empty, just a regular kitchen. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I'd been under a lot of stress lately, and the isolation wasn't helping. So, I went back to work, putting Ellie in the living room while I started sweeping and picking up the old magazines scattered around. But my mind kept drifting back to that chair. I couldn't stop thinking about it, how it had been out of place, even though I was sure I hadn't moved it. As the afternoon turned to evening, I decided to take a walk outside to clear my head. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. The woods around the cabin were still as death. Not a single sound from the trees or the underbrush. I walked down the narrow trail that led toward the creek, the one Grandma used to talk about all the time. The water had always been so clear, so peaceful. It was hard to imagine the world was full of anything but calm when you were there. But that day, even the creek felt off. The water rushed, but it didn't sound right. The wind wasn't blowing, but the trees swayed slightly, almost as if they were trying to warn me. Ellie stayed close to my side, her eyes darting back and forth, and I felt it again, the unease, that prickle on the back of my neck. But I ignored it, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I stayed by the water for a while, just listening to the sounds around me, trying to drown out the noise in my head. When I returned to the cabin, the sky was dark, and the cabin had taken on an even more foreboding look. The lights inside flickered when I turned them on, and I couldn't help but notice the shadows creeping along the walls. I decided to have a quick dinner, some canned soup and crackers, but the unease wouldn't leave. I sat at the table, glancing over at the chair again. The same one that had been facing the door earlier. It was back where it had been, but it looked more like it had been disturbed. I couldn't explain it, but something in my gut told me I wasn't alone. Ellie started growling. I could hear it from across the room. I went over to her, rubbing her ears, trying to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the creaky floor. They weren't loud, just faint enough to make me question if I was hearing things. I grabbed Ellie's leash and went outside, deciding I'd lock up and head back to town. But when I turned to face the door, I noticed it. A set of muddy footprints leading away from the cabin toward the forest. I could feel my heart pounding, but I couldn't stand there forever. I packed up everything, rushed to my truck, and pulled out of the driveway. I didn't care about the cabin anymore, didn't care about what Grandma had left behind. I was just trying to get out of there. As I drove, the road seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every shadow seemed too dark, every rustle in the trees too loud. Eventually, the cabin disappeared from view, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that cabin is still there, waiting. I don't think I'll ever go back. I don't think I'll ever find out what made those footprints. But the silence, the feeling of being watched, it still lingers. It's the kind of thing that you can't explain, only feel. The night was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you second-guess every decision you've ever made. I wasn't sure what had possessed me to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere for a weekend alone, but I was here now, and there was no turning back. The cabin stood on the edge of a dense forest, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd driven for hours along winding roads, through thick fog, until I could barely see the headlights of my car cutting through the haze. By the time I arrived, it was dark. Too dark to admire the scenery, but dark enough to make the cabin look almost otherworldly. It was an old wooden structure, faded from years of exposure to the elements. A small porch creaked in the wind, and the front door hung slightly ajar as if waiting for someone. The wooden steps leading up to the entrance had chipped paint and looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. My heart pounded a little harder in my chest as I grabbed my bag from the back of the car and made my way up the steps. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I stepped inside the cabin. The smell of pine wood and damp earth hit me immediately, mixing with the faint odor of mildew. It was cold inside too, but at least it didn't feel as freezing as outside. I set my bag down near the door and took in the space. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for some time. Dust covered the old furniture. Rustic chairs, a large stone fireplace, and a dining table with chairs scattered around it like they hadn't been touched in decades. I looked over at my dog, Max. He'd been with me through every single decision I'd made, whether I was moving to a new city or taking a trip like this. He was a large, shaggy mutt, and despite his rugged looks, he had a calm, friendly demeanor. He sniffed around cautiously, his ears twitching every now and then at unfamiliar sounds. I went to the fireplace and started the fire. There was no electricity in the cabin, just a few oil lamps scattered around to light the rooms. As the fire crackled to life, it cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, making the entire room feel even colder. The heat from the flames began to soothe my skin, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. It was as though I was being watched. Max seemed to sense it too. He kept pacing back and forth, his eyes darting toward the windows and the door, his tail stiff. I gave him a scratch behind the ears, trying to reassure him that everything was fine, but deep down, I wasn't so sure myself. I sat down on one of the chairs near the fire, the wood creaking under my weight. The wind outside howled, shaking the windows in their frames. It was a sound I was used to from my childhood, but it felt different now, darker, more menacing. Max whined softly, and I heard it too, a faint tapping sound from somewhere deeper in the house. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I looked at the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but nothing. The room was empty. Max growled low in his throat, his fur bristling. I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. It could have been an animal outside, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but why did it sound so close? I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and went toward the back of the cabin, where a narrow hallway led to what I assumed were the bedrooms. Max followed closely behind, his every step silent. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the fire behind me. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I moved cautiously. At the end of the hall was a small door, leading into what looked like a storage closet. It was cracked open, and the strange tapping sound had become louder. I was almost certain it was coming from inside. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. Max whined again, his body stiff as a board, as though warning me not to open it. I paused, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty, save for some old boxes stacked in the corner and a few rusted tools. But the tapping sound had stopped. I was about to close the door when something caught my eye. On the floor under the boxes there was a small, tattered rug. It looked out of place, as though it had been thrown there carelessly. My stomach dropped, and I knelt down to lift it. Underneath was a trapdoor. My pulse quickened. The tapping sound had come from beneath the floor. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. Maybe the cabin wasn't abandoned after all. Maybe someone had been living here, someone who didn't want to be found. Max let out a low growl again, and I could feel his anxiety mounting. I couldn't leave the door closed now. Whatever was under the floor had made its presence known, and I needed to know what it was. I grabbed the handle of the trapdoor and pulled it open. The creak of the hinges echoed through the cabin like a scream. There was nothing there but darkness. I turned on the flashlight and shined it down. The stairs led into a small, dirt-floored basement. I couldn't see much, but there were strange marks on the walls. faded, red streaks that looked too much like dried blood. My heart hammered in my chest. This had been a bad idea, but it was too late to back out now. Max whimpered softly, but I didn't hesitate. I descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The air down here was cold and damp, and the musty smell of mold hit my nostrils. The flashlight flickered as I swept it around the room. The walls were lined with old, rusted tools, axes, saws, and knives, some of which looked as though they had been used not for work, but for something far worse. There was an old wooden table in the center, stained with something dark that I didn't want to identify. But the worst part wasn't the tools or the stains, it was the picture on the wall. A faded photograph was nailed to the wall. It showed a family, 2 parents, a young child, and a man in his late 20s or early 30s. But something about the picture wasn't right. The family's eyes were scratched out, the image disfigured in a way that made it feel wrong. My breath caught in my throat. A loud thud echoed behind me. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. Max had followed me down the stairs, but now he was growling furiously, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the basement. I followed his gaze. A figure stood in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out the details, but I could feel the weight of its presence. The figure moved, and I jumped back in alarm, stumbling over a box. The flashlight flickered again, and when the light stabilized, the figure was gone. I scrambled to my feet, the cold sweat dripping down my back. Max was barking now, his growls becoming more frantic. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran up the stairs, slammed the trapdoor shut, and bolted out of the cabin into the freezing night air. Max was by my side, his tail tucked between his legs as we raced toward the car. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. By the time I reached the car and slammed the door shut behind me, the cold outside didn't matter. All I could think about was that basement, the family in the picture, the shadow I had seen. I didn't know who had lived in that cabin or what had happened to them, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I turned the key in the ignition and sped off down the road, leaving that cursed place behind me.